I'm going to start by introducing Stephanie Cacioppo, right, the Italian version, right, who is going to lead us off today, talking about some of the social interactions in brain health. Thank you.
We need to talk. That's why.
Yeah.
Thank you, Damien, for this introduction. Thanks to the organizer for having me. It's a great honor for me to be in this National Historic Building and to be talking about brain health and resilience in the social context. Improving brain health and social resilience represent one of the most important challenges facing contemporary science. And surprisingly, that's not a new topic. Already in 1978, when the task panel report to the US President's Commission on Mental Health under President Jimmy Carter emphasized that the importance of improving health care and easing the pain of those suffering from emotional distress syndromes, including loneliness, few anticipated that this issue would still need to be addressed 41 years later. And indeed, if you do a Medline search on all the scientists who are publishing papers on the topic of loneliness, you can see that since 1900, there is a rise in the publications of the papers on loneliness. And when scientists publish on loneliness, they also talk about social resilience. So for the sake of this workshop, let me define social resilience like Dr. John T. Cacioppo did. Social resilience is inherently a multi-level construct, revealed by capacities of individuals, but also groups. And that was a key point in his research. Groups to foster, engage in, and sustain positive social relationships and recover from social stressors and social isolation. So the premise behind loneliness and social resilience is that the brain is our key organ for forming, monitoring, maintaining healthy connections with others, and also for regulating our physiological processes relevant to morbidity and mortality. In other words, your brain is your main social organ. Your brain helps you organize your social structures, your social behaviors, and also regulate your social processes that are very important to determine your health and longevity. Yeah, you can say, we humans always think that we are unique compared to other species. And ourselves, even in this room, we think that we are unique and independent relative to those around us. At first glance, we can say, yes, it's a valid hypothesis. When we look around, other individuals certainly look distinct, independent, with no forces binding us together. But we all know that's not true. We have more similarities than differences. And we, as social species, we are connected across our lifespan to one another. We are wired to form social connections. So when I say that the brain is a key organ for forming, monitoring, and maintaining healthy connections with others, what I mean is that in a snap of the fingers, you can put your mind in a healthy or threatening relationship. The same exact objective social interaction or relationship can be perceived as caring and protective or as threatening and isolating. So there is a difference between objective and subjective isolation. You can feel lonely in a crowd and when you're doing public speaking, in a marriage, or you can feel extremely connected even when you're alone by yourself in a room, just by thinking about your loved ones. So let me define loneliness or perceived social isolation. It's really a discrepancy between what you want and what you have in a social relationship with a significant other. And how do we measure that, Damien? So we have different scales, and so we can use the UCLA scale that has 20 items, but scientists have studied all the items and came up with the 3 main items that can reliably test over and over loneliness. And these 3 items are displayed on the slide here. And no, social media doesn't protect from loneliness or perceived social isolation. We know that we are living longer than ever before, and the rise of the internet has transformed how we live, transformed how we shop, how we communicate with others, how we work. But still, even if we are increasingly connected digitally, the prevalence of loneliness or social isolation appears to be rising as well. From a prevalence estimated to be around 11% to 17% in the 70s, loneliness has increased to over 40% in middle-aged and older adults. So all depends how you use social media. If you use it to connect with someone and learn something together or stay in touch with their loved ones, that can really reduce and help loneliness and stay connected together. But if you use it as a destination, and we did research on that, and you have only online connections, that can really increase the feelings of loneliness. So, the former Surgeon General of the United States, Dr. Vivek Murthy, took that issue very seriously, and he defined loneliness as an epidemic because of this rise. And he's right, there is a growing problem of loneliness. As the prevalence of loneliness rises, we have more and more evidence that loneliness is a major risk factor for poor physical and mental health outcomes. For instance, a study did in 2010 meta-analysis showed that the odds ratio for dying earlier from loneliness was much higher than excessive drinking or obesity and air pollution. And in 2016, the same group did another meta-analysis with 70 other studies with more than 3 million people over an average of 7-year period, and they showed that the odds of dying earlier by loneliness was 26%, which is still more than obesity or air pollution. So we need to understand what the impact of loneliness or social connection on brain health. And we know from studies in animals or humans that it has implications in physical health and mental health. In physical health, it also alters the activation of the stress response, increased inflammatory mechanisms, increased also cell deaths in specific brain areas that I will describe next. But let me show you a quick difference between the brain of a lonely individual and the brain of someone who feels rejected. I did a meta-analysis of all the fMRI studies that had been done on social rejections, on that task of the cyber ball, when you expect to receive the ball but you don't and you feel rejected. And what we found is that a specific set of area is activated when people feel rejected. And this can be modulated as a function of who rejects you, a stranger or a significant other. And all the brain areas that we found were in a specific network involved in emotions, but also in expectations violation. But when you feel lonely, when the lonely brain activates or deactivates area, it's a different set of areas. It activates or deactivates areas in the social brain networks, as described by Ralph Adolphs. Areas that are important for empathy, compassion, perspective taking, or even being in synchrony with others, like with the mirror neuron system, that will be modulated as a function of your connections with others. The brain uses a rule that is quite simple: use it or lose it. And we know that from different social species, including that fascinating locust. The locust can go from solitary to social in the same year. So scientists love the locust because you can study the same brain in different social contexts, from solitary to very social. And what they've found is that from a solitary brain to a social brain, the locust has an increase in 30%. 30% larger brain when it's social than it's non-social. And humans have tried to do similar fMRI studies with people who had different social network size in Facebook or social media, and they saw also different differences in sizes in different parts of the social brain. What's interesting to me is that not the entire brain gets bigger when we get social. Only the brain areas that we need for social connections. And in the case of the locust, when it's social, it only needs to communicate with olfactory senses or with touch. Those brain areas involved in multisensory integration will be bigger or more active. But when it's alone, the visual cortex will be more activated because it needs to detect foes and danger at a distance. So it needs to have an increase in visual attention. And guess what? The same is true in humans. I did a meta-analysis in 2014 of all the studies that involved lonely brain, and what I found, and you can see that on panel C, is that the visual cortex is also more activated in lonely individuals. They have a hypervigilance to social threat, to potential danger. And they have hypoactivations in areas that are important for perspective taking, putting yourself in the shoes of the others, or connecting with others. So we know from all these studies that our brain's health and survival depend on our collective abilities and not our individual might. And this is not news. We know from years and years from social psychology that happy marriages have a myriad of beneficial effects on health. Through different pathways, people who are married have fewer physical problems, they have a better survival rate from some illnesses, and they also have a lower mortality rate. And this makes sense with our evolutionary theory of life, that across human history, we survived and prospered by bonding together in couples, families, tribes, to provide companionship, mutual protection, and aid. But marital status is not the main factor. We don't have a magic ring. Rather, the marriage quality matters. The relationship, the quality of the relationship with a significant other, that's what is crucial. So, Damien, I'm still waiting for the question. What does that mean to be significant? Right? I just said significant other. Well, am I significant to you in this room? Are we significant to one another? That's an interesting question. We can test that in different species. For instance, in baboons, we found that female baboons who have a significant other, like a best friend female, they live longer than others. But still, that doesn't really address the question, I believe. So scientists have pushed the question a little bit further, and they tested two species, monogamous titi monkeys and polygynous squirrel monkeys, and they removed the significant other, or who they thought there was a significant other from the partner. And so when in the non-monogamous, they remove the partner from the pair, there is no stress response, no increase in cortisol, because they can have another partner. They are not monogamous. But when they remove the offspring, what they found is that a huge increase in plasma cortisol. The opposite was found in the monogamous titi monkeys. When they removed the monogamous titi monkeys from one another, they saw a huge stress response. But when they removed the offsprings from the pair, what did they find? Nothing. Vacation time, right? I'm not saying that the offsprings were not significant to the parents, but for this kind of social hierarchy, the partner is the most significant individual. And this also makes sense with our evolutionary heritage that has shaped our brain and biology to incline us to have different ways of feeling and thinking or acting towards others and towards a significant others. For instance, a variety of biological mechanisms have evolved that capitalize on aversive signals to motivate us, to motivate our behaviors that promote our chances of short-term survival. So in that framework of evolutionary theory, we think that loneliness is like a biological signal that tells us that there is something wrong with our social body. And like hunger or thirst or physical pain, we need to do something to reconnect with others to survive. And we know that when we feel lonely, there is a huge increase in stress response. The HPA axis responds extremely, like when we see physical pain and when we feel burn or when we're thirsty. So we studied the different pathways that could play a role in loneliness, and we identified 8 main pathways that I will describe in the next slide very briefly. The first one is that loneliness decreases sleep salubrity. when Dr. John T. Cacioppo investigated this question, he asked participants to come to the lab and have them sleep for 2 nights at the hospital, and they found that the lonely and non-lonely people on the second night had more micro-awakenings than the non-lonely individuals, because their brain, that was the hypothesis, was monitoring all the time for potential danger. Then, as I just said, loneliness also increases HPA activations and can predict not only the cortisol levels, but the cortisol level the next day. Loneliness also increases vascular resistance and blood pressure. And this is not only a positive correlation, this is a causal link. We did studies and led by John T. Cacioppo over a period of time, 15 years in Chicago with older adults, and they had different measurements every year, and over a period of 5 waves, we could tell whether loneliness was predictive or higher blood pressure or not. And even when we controlled for all the standard predictors or stressors, or they found that loneliness can predict blood pressure increase, and we recently found exactly the same thing in younger adults as well. So loneliness also increases defensiveness. So I said that we have a hyperattention for social threat, but we're also defensive when we are lonely. Still with the physiological mechanism, loneliness increases inflammatory substrate and decreases viral immunity. Loneliness, based on these longitudinal studies that I just described, also leads to depressive symptomatology. So loneliness is a different construct than depression. When you're depressed, you're sad. When you're lonely, you're not only sad, you also feel in danger. So we found that loneliness leads to depression, and some animal studies demonstrated that animals were separated from their significant other for at least 2 weeks, start showing signs of depressive symptomatology as well. Loneliness increases prepotent responding. What does that mean? More impulsivity. People who feel lonely tend to gamble more, drink more, and also they eat more fat food every day, around 30% more than non-lonely individuals. And in line with this impulsivity, loneliness also increases suicide rates and ideation. Loneliness increases self-centeredness, but not for the reason that we initially thought, mostly because of self-preservation mechanism and self-survival principles, which goes along with the fact that loneliness increases defensiveness. So how do I know that? We did surveys, we followed people years after years, and also we did neuroimaging, fMRI, EEG. So in fMRI, we showed the IAPS, negative pictures, social and non-social negative pictures, and analyzed the brain activity in response to one compared to the other. And what was found is that lonely individuals show hyperactivation of the visual cortex in response to negative social stimuli compared to non-social, and hypoactivations of the areas like temporoparietal junctions on both sides of the brain here, which suggests that they tend not to put themselves in the shoes of the actors presented in the stimuli. Also, we found that lonely individuals tend to show deactivations of the reward systems when in response to positive social versus non-social stimuli. How about brain dynamics? It's great to know what brain areas are activated, but it's also important to know when they are activated and how fast. So we used the same exact stimuli and presented a paradigm where we had a fixation cross, the pictures, and asked the participants then to rate each image. And while they were doing that, we were recording their brain activity using high-density EEG sensors, as you can see here. And the results are presented on this slide. You don't need to know exactly the method here about brain segmentation that I used, but I will be happy to describe it after my talk if it's of any interest. What you can see here is that for the non-lonely participants, it takes about 300 milliseconds, which is quite expected, for them to differentiate social threat compared to non-social threat. But for lonely people, they are twice faster. Immediately, 100 milliseconds after the onset of a picture of a social negative threat, their attention rises up and they're already in a survival mode, if I may say. We also have convergent evidence that the brain network for alertness is hyperconnected in lonely individuals. We did connectivity analysis in a resting state from participants who were lying in the MRI. And what you can see here, the red network of alertness is hyperactivated in lonely individuals. And also their supramarginal gyrus network, which is supposed to be more into perspective taking, self-order, our relationships, is hyperconnected. So all this data, behavioral, neuroimaging, EEG, suggest that there is a paradox with loneliness. People tend to receive this biological signal that they need to approach others to survive. There is something wrong with our social body, they need to be connected. So they feel isolated and they have this huge motivation to connect. But at the same time, their brain is in hyper alert for a potential threat. The wrong attention is put on everyone and they see more foes than friends. And then they tend to see more cues confirming their hypotheses and misinterpret the facial expressions of people they're interacting with and tend to have behavioral confirmation processes that take place, which leads to withdrawal. So to summarize, I will say that loneliness is a significant risk factor for morbidity and early mortality, and there are multiple pathways linking loneliness to this morbidity and mortality. And although the deleterious effects of each pathway may be limited, their cumulative effects over time aggregate to produce significant damage to health and well-being. What's interesting is that it's not unique, not specific to humans. We found the same thing in the literature in animals and humans. So what are the remaining questions? There are many, and one could be that the temporal dynamics for the operations of loneliness and for each specific pathway need to be better understood. The other question that I might want to ask is loneliness associated with many or all of the pathways in everyone? Or is it associated with different pathways or a different subset in different individuals or different social contexts? And why? And when? And how? And finally, what interventions mitigate the deleterious effects of loneliness? That's it. Thank you for your attention.
I have a quick question. So we were talking before about this question about interventions. And so coming from the National Institute on Aging, this research gets quite a lot of attention from the lay public. And everyone wants to know what's being done about this. And I know that in the past we've talked about just the need for evidence that we can move these loneliness targets experimentally. And I wonder if you can comment on that, the level of evidence for that.
Yes, absolutely. And I remember John saying that once we did all this research, NIH came and said, what do we do about it? Right? So we did a meta-analysis, and he started also doing a meta-analysis in 2011 to see what worked and what didn't work. So we especially know what interventions do not work. So social support doesn't necessarily help. It works a little bit, but it's not as significant as other interventions. And why is that? So imagine a patient at the hospital. We think that it's a luxury to be in a private room, right? But when we know all the literature of feeling disconnected from others, it can be sometimes distressing for a patient to be by himself or by herself in a room. And that can feel extremely lonely. And when they press the button and call the nurse, it's not in-room service at the hotel, right? They didn't choose to be there. And the nurse can be as nice as possible and provide all the care that is needed. It's only one way. The person receives care all the time and doesn't give back And we know from the evolutionary theories of social individuals that our survival depends on mutual aid and protection. And so it's a two-way street, exchange of information. And having a purpose in life is also provided sharing information about what do you know and how you can help others as well, even when you are in need of their care. So social support only on one way doesn't really help. Then a group intervention. People are lonely, we're going to put them all together. Great idea. No. Right? What did I say? There is a paradox. People want to go to these meetings, but once they find themselves in those meetings, they see foes rather than friends. They misinterpret what people are saying and feel defensive, and then they play the blame game. And at the end, everyone goes back home alone and even more distressed because they found confirmation in behaviors of others. So they really need to have group support with parental control, if I may say, with someone explaining what reality is, what the others are really saying to them, rather than letting them misinterpret interactions because of their lonely brain. Might see negative information more than positive information. Also, yesterday we talked about depressed individuals or lonely individuals who remember more negative memories than positive, and that's true as well. So these kind of interventions don't really work. Interventions that work better are cognitive behavioral therapies oriented towards the functions of the social brain network that I described.
Thank you. Lovely talk. I remember seeing a talk by John several years ago where he said that loneliness predicted things over and above neuroticism. Am I remembering this correctly? Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I'm still trying to understand from the literature kind of what loneliness is, in the sense of, it sounds like it's not necessarily a function of like objective things about a person's social network or their partnership. So is it more of a trait level characteristic? Is it sort of a sum of like paranoia and antagonism? Like, can you say a little bit more about what you think it is?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So first of all, we all have the potential and all have the brain areas to feel lonely at a point in time. So it's not an on-off symptom, or it's really modulations of some brain areas depending on our mind states or mood. We can put ourselves in a lonely state in a second, right? Then the way we recover from it, it's different. But so neuroticism, we studied that, and we found that people who are less responsive to some interventions are neurotic individuals, or less open individuals as well. And so I'm not saying that all neurotic people are lonely, quite the contrary, but that they are less open to being helped in terms of loneliness. Then I think really it's not like a trait. It's more a state, given that you can go in and out of it so easily. And we demonstrated that in some patients that I remember John hypnotizing them, and some people who were totally open and could really dive in this lonely state.
So I have a question. So one of the things that I liked about your talk in the very beginning was, and it was related to some of the discussion yesterday, was about it's hard to define brain health unless we know about what we care about. What's the outcome that we're actually, what's the target, right? And in the beginning, you kind of discussed some of those targets. It was quality of life, kind of life expectancy, the development of psychopathologies, because it was kind of, we're starting to go down the road of getting a little more specific. And then what you showed later was that there are, after you've defined or you've identified what you've described as being lonely, you see brain changes in the animal models. You see cortisol changes. You saw behavioral changes that are all related to this risk factor of loneliness towards that outcome.
Right.
The question is, now that's related to this particular forum, is which ones of those things that are changing or related to loneliness are kind of related specifically to loneliness or causative of loneliness versus changes that the body or brain or whatever is making that's kind of resilient to the effect, to the risk factor of loneliness. Is there a way that you can think of, like, how you can differentiate those two things?
I mean, the longitudinal studies that have been done really help understanding what happens when we control for all the other factors. Even genetic expressions, we know that loneliness is heritable at 30-35%. But what's interesting is that loneliness per se is not what's heritable. It's just suffering, the sensitivity to social rejection that will be transmitted. And that can be a trigger to all these other factors. And then what we found is that it's also constellations of factors like cortisols and the sleep salubrity and the HPA axis that will be driving the increase of the effect of loneliness.
All right. I think one last question, and that is it's related to Russ's talk yesterday,
yes.
right? It talks about the individual, the measurement variability and the individual variability of of what we're looking at, what we're targeting. In this case, in loneliness. Do you have a sense of, what are we? How you talked about it being a state or trait, right? Well, how variable is that? In the temporal domain, as we're thinking about prediction and things, and things like that.
Yeah, so very similar to what Russ described yesterday. Loneliness, when it's chronic for at least 2 or 4 weeks, it doesn't move that fast. Mm-hmm. So it's between T0 and T14 that you can see the fastest changes, and studies will need to be done to understand the dynamic of loneliness in every individual. What we know is that loneliness does not discriminate. It touches every gender, every ethnicity, every context. But what we know is that there are 3 different types of loneliness or connections in one individual that hasn't been studied yet. And that could help address your question. First, we have intimate connections, the one that you have with your spouse or with your most significant partner. Then you have relational connections, like the one you have with people in this room, at work, people with whom you can shake hands, that you have a nice interaction. And then you have the collective connection, the collective identity. Do you think that you belong to a group, to NIH, to NAS, to the country, to the world, And I recently did a study at the University of Chicago to try to understand the interactions of these 3 different types of connections in every individual by following them over a period of time, so different 4 waves. And they don't move too much. The collective identity doesn't move as fast as the intimate ones, for instance, or the relational one. And I found that collective connections tend to be protective of personal loneliness. So if you have a sense that you belong to someone, even if you feel lonely every other day, the fact that you belong to a group that is bigger than yourself and you have a bigger purpose in life would be, even if it's a slower time scale, to address your question, that would be really helpful for you to feel less lonely on a daily basis. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.